Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger, and holy crap, do I have just a rad show for you today, tonight, this morning, whenever you're listening to Geek Therapy Radio, whether it's the broadcast or the podcast. You're in for a treat tonight. We're talking retro tech and retro tech memories, but it's not just for me. I have 4 guests on the show, and I'm just going to rattle them off right now. George Noory from Coast to Coast AM, Clint from Lazy Game Reviews on YouTube, Colin from This Does Not Compute on YouTube, and David Murray, the 8-bit guy from YouTube. All 4 of my guests are weighing in on their most fond retro tech memories, and some not so fond, but mostly fond. And I'm just going to tell you right now what triggered this show, what made me think of doing a show like this week, is I've been pulling out a lot of stuff from storage. As most of my regular listeners know, that I've had my storage unit up there in Kingwood for the past few years. I've got an email a few weeks ago after the most recent rains that my unit definitely flooded, so I need to come check it out. It's kind of good timing. I mean, it's bad, but good timing in that my wife and I just bought a house, so I've been setting up my home studio again, which means pulling out all of my vintage gear and modern gear and my microphone, tube preamplifiers and Mackie HR824 studio monitors and all sorts of fun things out of storage. And it gave me the opportunity to do inventory. By the way, long story short about the storage unit, it flooded, but not that bad. As a matter of fact, I'm in my home studio using a 75-inch TV as my computer monitor that was under 6 to 7 inches of water. It was on its side, so the edge of the screen was covered in 6 to 7 inches of water. And you cannot tell now. I was worried that the screen was destroyed, at least on that side. Obviously, the TV works, but it had lots of splotches on the right-hand side of the screen, and now that I'm looking at the screen while recording, all of those splotches are gone. They've dried up. You can't tell that there was ever water damage to this TV. It was miraculous. So I've been pulling a lot of cool things out of storage, and one of the things I found was my old mini disc player from the early 2000s. It was a mini disc player / recorder. It was a Sony mini disc Walkman with a condenser microphone jack as well as a headphone jack. What? A headphone jack? What the heck is a headphone jack? But no, this little mini disc player, it was such cool technology. It ran off of one AA battery seemingly forever and took brilliant stereo digital recordings. So not only did I find my mini disc Walkman recorder, but I found a stack of several mini discs, 7, 8, 9, 10 mini discs that I know contain recordings of old gigs, old jam sessions, old discussions from high school. So I can't wait to hear what kind of nonsense, tomfoolery, and silliness is preserved perfectly for all time in that digital mini disc format. And that kind of spurred me to make this show. I reached out to Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute, who I've had on the show several times in the past, and I've gone on podcasts with him too. Hope to do it again in the future, by the way. It's always a ton of fun talking to Colin, as well as David and Clint, and George Noory. They've all been on the show in the past, but Colin, I knew, had a special affinity for mini disc players. It's hard to pronounce. So I knew he would appreciate that I found it in storage, and I could tell that his eyes just lit up. It was just an email, but he's like, dude, you have no idea how much I love mini discs. And I was just like, I'm going to make a show about it. I'm going to ask different influencers from around media. So George Noory here coming up in a moment to share his favorite retro tech memory. And then various YouTube channels, big YouTube channels. So this does not compute with Colin, Clint from Lazy Game Reviews, and David from the 8-Bit Guy on YouTube, all sharing their fond retro tech memories. But now we're going to turn it over to George Noory. George is the reason I got into a radio. One night in middle school, scanning through the radio, I didn't want to hear music. I just wanted to hear voices talking in the background so that I could fall asleep. And what I stumbled upon in 1995 or 1996 was Coast to Coast AM, which wound up making me not go to sleep. Sharing ghost stories and alien stories that had me basically tucked up under the covers, terrified for my life, looking out the window for UFOs and aliens and ghosts and demons and such. But I had never heard anything like that on radio before. It was so cool, and I said, man, if they're talking about ghosts and aliens and stuff, I can have a radio show eventually about technology and video games and geek stuff. And here I am today, 2019, staring down the barrel of 2020 with a show called Geek Therapy Radio, talking about just that. So it is an honor to introduce George Noory to you in this episode, talking about his favorite bit of retro tech. George, take it away, my friend.
Sure, I remember technology. Back in the 80s, I had my phone attached to my car. We didn't have cell phones. Had one of those things just stuck in there with an antenna. But what I really remember, my pager, because I kept it with me all the time. And those things were different because you could give your pager number out to everybody, and what you would get is a paged phone number. You had no idea, unless you could remember who that person was, who was calling you. So you'd either go to a payphone, go back to your office, or wherever to make that phone call, because I didn't have a cell phone with me unless I went to my car. Anyways, great memories of old technology.
Thank you so much for those memories, George. And yeah, I actually remember my first pager. It was a Mountain Dew pager. When was this? 1995, 96? Something around there. I had to drink a lot of Mountain Dew to get those proofs of purchase and get my first Mountain Dew pager. And the only person who ever texted me, like once in the entire year, was my mom. It wasn't as cool as I thought it would be. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. We're going to hear from Clint from Lazy Game Reviews next. It's going to be great. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and I must say, I love doing this show from my almost completely set up home studio. Like I mentioned before, if you're just joining the show tonight, I am speaking through my precious tube microphone amp. Actually, it's the Universal Audio 4710D. It's 4 channels of mic preamp that you can dial in as much solid state or tube as you'd like. And for this first broadcast using this setup, I am, of course, dialed in to 100% tube. And doesn't it sound lovely? It just seems like if this is a radio broadcast, then yes, my voice should go through a tube at some point in the signal chain. Tubes, AM radio, it all works. So, one of my favorite pieces of retro tech is tube microphone amplifiers. No, they don't have the transient response as solid state or FET, field effect transistor. But that's completely fine. It's a different character, different sonic character that you get with tubes that you don't get with solid state. There's nothing wrong with solid state. it's just nice to know that my voice is being converted to 300 volts of electricity passing through a tube and out the other end. And oh, it's so nice. But I explained my setup in the first segment. If you haven't heard the first segment, lucky for you, the podcast is available 24/7. Actually, if you're listening to this broadcast right now here in Houston, the podcast has most likely been available for several hours. I usually drop the show hours and hours and hours, actually, maybe more than 24 hours before the show airs. So Fridays is when I drop the podcast version of this show. But the other 4 days of the work week, Monday through Thursday, is a fresh new podcast. No segments, no commercials, just pure podcast. And I try to time them out to be the length of the average commute. So usually what it amounts to, I think on average, is about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so, in between 20 and 30 minutes of just uninterrupted stream of consciousness, geeking out about awesome things. So Geek Therapy Radio podcast, grab it in your favorite podcast player. Of course, we here prefer the iHeartRadio app. Pocket Cast is also great on Android, but you also have your Apple Podcast player on your iOS device, which is what I prefer when I'm listening to podcasts on my iPad. We have so much modern technology. In the theme of today's show, as I reached out to some friends of the show and I asked them to tell me what their favorite retro tech memories were. Not just their favorite retro tech memories, but any memories that stood out to them of retro tech. So my next guest here is friend of the show and just awesome guy all around, Clint. He heads up a little channel there on YouTube called Lazy Game Reviews, which is an awesome channel. And I guarantee you, just the random listener to this broadcast or this podcast has seen an LGR thumbnail come up on YouTube. It's kind of a big channel. A few million subscribers. Clint is amazing, and I can geek out with him for hours. I had him on the show a few episodes back, and we're talking about Computer Reset up there in Dallas, which is just a treasure trove of vintage computer gear and peripherals. I still need to make my way up to Dallas and see what I can scavenge out of that find. It's a Disneyland for retro computer enthusiasts. One of the things about being a retro computer enthusiast isn't just, using old disk drives and using old versions of MS-DOS and Windows 3.1 and Windows 95 and coding in BASIC and all these sorts of things. The peripherals, the sight and smell and touch and sound of these old peripherals, especially keyboards. It's not a stretch to the imagination to say that a lot of vintage computer enthusiasts, the holy grail of vintage keyboards, that is what your fingers touch and how you interact with old computers and modern computers most of the time, the keyboard and mouse, but specifically the keyboard, the holy grail is the IBM Model M. So we're going to hear from Clint from Lazy Game Reviews, from his memories of the Model M. Clint, take it away.
Greetings, this is Clint from the LGR YouTube channel. In terms of my favorite bit of retro tech, that is mighty difficult to narrow down, but one that I've been enjoying a whole lot recently is my IBM Model M SSK, or Space Saving Keyboard. I am a huge fan of mechanical keyboards and buckling spring boards in particular, and IBM's Model M series of keyboards just has this legendary status that can honestly be a bit inflated at times, but when you get just the right one, it's all cleaned up and, in my case, modded and has an interesting form factor, then it really does live up to the hype, both in terms of the way it looks and the way it feels, and in turn sounds. I mean, just listen to this thing. Every keystroke feels solid. There's no second guessing if you've pressed down a key. The keycaps themselves are highly enjoyable to touch and just to look at. And then there's the form factor of this SSK, the space-saving keyboard that doesn't have the numpad or anything over there. And while I do use that and prefer that on certain computer systems, on the ones that I'm using this one on, it just, I don't know. It just pleases me. This one's also been bolt modded, so it is much more solid underneath. It doesn't have the little plastic rivets holding the bottom of the board in place, so it's much longer lasting with these metal screws or bolts in there. And yeah. Anyway, Model M, especially this one, the SSK Model M. Oh yes, one of my favorite bits of retro tech.
Thank you very much, Clint, for your input. The Model M is definitely the holy grail. I hope to own one day myself. Every time I go onto eBay and look for Model M's, I mean, I go onto eBay to look for a lot of stuff. eBay, by the way, I know most of you listening already know this, but eBay is such a wonderful resource for vintage and retro technology. What's most fascinating to me, and I'll get back to keyboards in a second, what's most fascinating to me is that a lot of old technology, a lot of old computers especially, that, you know, a 1985 IBM whatever, dual 5.25-inch floppy bays, can't even run Windows 3.1 really. It's not powerful enough for all that mess. But those old computers that most of us, if we grew up with them, we either gave away or threw away or recycled or what have you, those are worth money. Those old computers that we gave away or threw away thinking that they were absolutely worthless and thinking in our heads, oh, who's going to want this old piece of junk? You would be bamboozled to see how much your old computer is going for on eBay nowadays. It's kind of like vintage cars, vintage SUVs. Old SUVs were almost worthless just a few years ago. Now they are stratospheric in their value. A car that just a few years ago might be worth a couple of grand, or you'd give away or happily give to a junkyard, 15 to 20 grand now for that old SUV. An old Ford Bronco? Forget about it. It's worth some cash now. So anyways, keyboards. I do have a mechanical keyboard. I probably will not use that here in my recording studio for reasons being that they are very loud. I bought the mechanical keyboard thinking that, oh, this will help with my gaming. It'll make me a better gamer. Not so much. It feels really good, but I was at my mom's house. That's where my keyboard resides, my mechanical keyboard, and my wife was with me. I said, hey, do you mind if I take this home? Clickety-clack, clack, 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 clickety-clack. She's like, It might stay here. I wouldn't mind if it stayed here. Anyways, more Geek Therapy Radio coming up. I've got Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. He is a longtime friend of the show. Remember mini discs? I do. Colin does. We're going to talk about them next on Geek Therapy Radio. Don't go anywhere. Good show, isn't it? Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and if you're just joining us on the broadcast or the podcast, I don't know why you'd just be joining a podcast without listening to all the stuff before this segment, but I'm talking to various influencers across the internet, YouTube, and broadcast radio about their favorite retro tech memories. Remember mini discs? I do, and my guest Colin from This Does Not Compute on YouTube does. Colin, what you got to say about mini discs?
I love the mini disc format, and I say that not from kind of a recent perspective of nostalgia, looking back at it as being just this cool thing. I've always loved the mini disc format ever since I got started with it. It actually kind of comes back to tape. I had a very interesting relationship with the cassette tape. It was never a primary format for me. I grew up listening to vinyl records, and then by the time those had run their course, I was old enough to start saving up my allowance and, money earned on the side as a kid and buy CDs. cassettes were really just kind of an in-the-middle thing for utility kind of recording. If there was a song I wanted to tape off the radio or I wanted to take with me, for portable music before I got my first portable CD player. And so I found myself in, I think it was 1996, my home cassette deck had died. It was a hand-me-down. It was from sometime in, I think, the late 80s. It was not a high-end deck. It was actually a pretty entry-level cassette deck. And it wasn't really worth repairing. So I set out to replace it. And I went to the electronics store fully expecting to just come home with another cassette deck. I figured, maybe I'd upgrade to something a little bit nicer, but I figured I'd still be using cassette for at least a few more years. But in the middle of that store, on a pallet, they had all these boxes. And on the side of the box, it said Sony Minidisc Combo. And so I asked the sales rep, what's up with that? I've never heard of this thing. And they went on to explain how it's this format that Sony was trying to make popular to kind of replace the cassette. And it was like a miniature compact disc, but you could record to it. CD burners were not very common at that time. And while they did exist, they were expensive. So they were still kind of out of the reach of the average consumer. So the promise of digital quality audio that sounded to most people just as good as a CD, but with the convenience of being able to record to it yourself, was very appealing to me. And what was even more appealing was that combo deal specifically. In the box, it came with a home deck that you could connect to your stereo, and that one was capable of recording to minidisc, but it also included a small portable player, along with a few accessories like a couple of blank discs to get you started. And I'd like to say the price for that whole combo was something like $350 maybe. There were many of them on the pallet. It didn't sound like they were moving from that store very quickly. And so that, of course, would give one a bit of apprehension. It's this new format and they're not selling a ton of them and you hadn't heard of it before. But the thing that kind of sealed the deal for me, what allowed me to mentally take that plunge, was the fact that it was a Sony product. If you didn't grow up through that era, you don't really have it baked into your brain that Sony was just synonymous with home electronics. You really couldn't go wrong with a Sony product. Yeah, they'd occasionally come up with a dud or something like that. But for the most part, you knew if you were buying something branded as Sony, it was going to be at least worth the money you paid for it. And Sony was also pretty well known to be advanced with its technology. And so I figured, this Sony minidisc thing was worth a shot. So I bought it. I went home with that minidisc combo instead of a cassette deck. I got rid of all the tapes and went minidisc from there on out. And I loved it from the beginning. Once I learned what that format was capable of, just how convenient it was to record to. There was no fast forwarding, rewinding. It really was like working with a CD, but one that you could erase whenever you wanted. You could easily just blank it out and re-record over it. You could delete individual songs. You could delete portions of songs. The amount of editing capability was just amazing. And just how good it sounded. It really did sound just like a CD. The portable player was absolutely tiny. It was barely larger than the disc itself, and the disc itself was even smaller than a cassette. It was a very, very compelling package, at least for me as a teenager at the time and very much interested in technology. So I used minidisc even more than I had used cassettes. I found myself not really wanting to take a portable CD player anymore. I would just record my CDs onto mini discs and carry them around just because the player got so much better battery life and it was just so much smaller and more convenient. And of course, I thought it was just cooler. Then the iPod came about and the MP3 era, and mini disc kind of became irrelevant in some ways, but for me, it actually had a bit of a second wind. And that was during college in the early 2000s. I found myself not necessarily using it for music playback anymore. I had taken the plunge and bought an iPod myself and absolutely loved the way that all worked, but you couldn't record audio with the iPod. And so in college, I found myself leaning on minidisc even more to record things like lectures in class and interviews, and just the high quality sound you could get and how flexible all of that was just so compelling. It worked out really, really well, and it was so versatile. And I know a lot of other people found that format the same way. In fact, minidisc was incredibly popular with people who did live recordings of concerts. If you go to archive.org and search through its live music recordings archive, if you check the source information for a lot of the recordings between, say, the mid-90s and early 2000s, you'll find that a lot of them were recorded to minidisc, just because of how easy and convenient and high quality of recordings you could get out of such a small package. You know, today it's easy to look back at minidisc and kind of understand, okay, yeah, I mean, that was a thing. It's this highly portable, easy editing, fully digital, music and audio format. But it's mind-boggling when you realize that format was launched in 1992. If it was launched in 2001, it would be easy to understand because our technology was at that level in 2001. But 1992, there were still plenty of people rocking cassettes and vinyl records. And you've got this incredibly powerful, fully digital editing literally in the palm of your hand. The very first minidisc recorder was actually a portable unit. I'd like to say the vast majority of minidisc devices, the hardware itself, the vast majority sold were portable units. That Sony had managed to cram that much technology into such a small package and launch it in 1992, which means that the development of it happened in the late 80s. It just blows my mind. So I still love the minidisc format. I'm never going to get rid of any of my hardware. I'm never going to get rid of any of the media. And believe it or not, you can still buy brand new Sony minidisc media. For how much longer, who knows? And right now you have to import it from Japan. It's not really sold worldwide. And how minidisc was supposedly a flop, well, that's perhaps a story for another time. But in terms of all of these audio and technology formats that we've had, I think minidisc really should rank up there towards the top as being one of, if not the most innovative. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening, he says. Thank you, Colin, for coming on Geek Therapy Radio yet again. You know what? We could listen to you. I especially could listen to you talk about retro tech for hours. So it is a blessing upon this universe that you have a YouTube channel, This Does Not Compute, in which you spend a lot of time doing just that. Trying to install modern versions of Windows on old Pentium 2 computers. That is just ridiculous. That's just silliness. And we are so thankful that you attempt such silliness. A little bit of behind the scenes. This whole episode was spawned by my reaching out to Colin after I found my mini disc player in storage. It had survived the test of time in storage, and more importantly to me, I was most happy to find like a stack of 10 mini discs. That's all stuff I recorded back in high school and college. I can't wait to go through those discs, preserved perfectly and digitally, and see what treasures and stupidity is on those mini discs from high school. I'm Johnny Hemberger, your mental curator. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. The 8-Bit Guy, David Murray, next. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. I am thrilled to have you listening this evening, this afternoon, or this morning. Whether you're listening to the broadcast or the podcast, I truly appreciate your time, and I hope you're having fun. If you're just joining me tonight, I am talking to various YouTube influencers, tech influencers. George Noory was on with me in the first segment, and I'm talking to them all about their memories of retro tech. So before I have David Murray on, the 8-bit guy, right here in this segment in a minute or two, I want to share my memories on what he's going to bring up. Specifically, PDAs. Back in middle school, it may have been 9th grade or so. Yeah, it must have been 9th grade. So high school, I had a Palm Pilot. And I also had a Compaq iPac. It was Windows CE. It was a color backlit screen. But the Palm Pilot wound up being my favorite PDA for how simple it was. I took all of my notes in 9th grade and most of 10th at least with my Palm Pilot, and I would bring my little Windows CE PDA to school with me as well, and people would make fun of me. They'd say I was such a nerd and such a dork for having that with me. This was 1999, 2000-ish, and I told them, 1998 even, before that, I said, mark my words, within 10 years, the cool kids will have this, and the nerds won't. You'll be thought of to be a nerd if you don't have a device like this in your pocket. I said, this is where phones are going. The cell phones and the PDAs, one day they're going to be one thing, and we're all going to carry it around within the next decade. Mark my words. And that is exactly what happened. First with the BlackBerry, that was the first to merge the PDA with the smartphone, and then in its most revolutionary form, the iPhone changed the game in around 2008, 2009. Changed the world, changed social media as we know it, because now we could post selfies and interact from anywhere in the world, anywhere in the city, anywhere we are with our smartphone connected to the internet. It was an absolute game changer. But before all that came old 8-bit computers, old digital cameras that were garbage by today's standard, and PDAs, the Palm Pilot, various Windows CE powered devices. So that is what my guest David Murray is going to talk about here, his fond memories of that old tech. And without further ado, I will pass the torch, aka the mic, to my friend David. David, take it away.
Hi, Johnny. Thanks for having me on the show. So you want to know, what kind of fond memories I have of, old gadgets back in the day? Well, yeah, there were quite a few. I mean, we had a lot of gadgets back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, before we had smartphones, there were just so many different types of products. You go out and you could do shopping for cameras or camcorders or PDAs, calculators, GPS navigation devices, or, of course, your portable cassette players or CD players, and of course, telephones themselves. Today, the smartphones have just replaced, all of those things, along with countless other, things that you might not consider gadgets, like, encyclopedias or books and maps and stuff like that. But yeah, so yes, I'm glad we have smartphones and then they've got all that stuff built in. But at the same time, I sort of miss the excitement of shopping for all the different gadgets and stuff that we used to have. But yeah, I can tell you about some of the gadgets that I think that I thought would be cool, for example, and turned out not to be. For example, I always had this thing for PDAs. Even back when I was a kid in probably like junior high school, these PDAs started to come out, and some of them looked really cool. Casio, for example, had one that looked like a little folding, like a little palm top computer or something like that. It had a, fairly large screen and a keyboard on it and all this kind of stuff. But all these PDAs, including the Palm Pilot, which I eventually got as well, I'd get them home and I'd be really excited about them, and I'd play with them for, a day or two, and then they just wind up sitting on a shelf forever and rotting, and I think some of them ended up in the trash, some of them ended up in garage sales. But it's just one of those things that they always really excited me, but the practical uses for them seemed to be not that great. And I think a lot of the reason is because they didn't have BASIC, particularly the little ones with the keyboards. It's like if they'd had BASIC or some way that you could actually program them, then they would have had continued use because I could have found newer and newer things to do with them. But you were usually pretty much stuck with whatever they could do from the factory, and that would wear thin pretty quickly. On the converse of that, I think probably one of the most influential pieces of technology I got was the Commodore VIC-20, and I was 6 years old when I got that. And I think I can, it's amazing how vividly I can remember getting the VIC-20 and then using it. And the thing is, because it had BASIC and ROM, and of course a user manual telling me how to use it, the possibilities of what I could do with that machine were endless. I mean, the way I saw that machine, it was like a window into another dimension or universe or something like that. And I could make it do anything I wanted to as long as I could figure out how, and so I was constantly trying to solve the next mystery and figure out, how to make it do this or that. And I was always getting better at making it do things. And of course, then the C64 came along, which we ended up getting as well. And that was like a VIC-20 on steroids. And so I could do even more stuff with that. And the games and particularly the online community of the C64 was very different. There was like this huge interconnected world of bulletin board systems. And suddenly I had access to use my computer to connect to other computers and talk to other people and transfer, download software from other computers in other parts of the world, which was, so again, my computer had kind of become like a window into, a larger world, and I could kind of stick my hand through there and grab things in a metaphorical sense. I think my first webcam, which was, of course, a Connectix QuickCam, was probably also a very influential piece of technology for me because it was the first time I was able to easily capture pictures from the outside world and get them into my computer. And I think a lot of people at the time didn't understand my fascination with that and all of the possibilities it opened up. And, of course, I shortly bought the Casio QV10, which was which is an actual digital camera you could carry around with you in your pocket and take pictures of stuff. And that, again, was such a monumental shift, or like a paradigm shift in thinking for me, because suddenly, I didn't have to get my film developed. But I think the instant gratification was really a lot of that, because I could immediately have access to the pictures, where in the past, it's like I could take a photograph on my camera and I wasn't really excited about it because I knew it would be possibly months before I used up the roll of film and then would go get it developed. And so that meant that having the digital cameras, I started taking lots of pictures because I could see them immediately and share them with people and things like that. And so, I think my first digital camera probably changed my life more than most of the other gadgets, unless you want to talk about the smartphone, but that's a little bit too modern.
Yeah, thank you, David, so much for coming back on Geek Therapy Radio and sharing those wonderful memories of old technology. It can be argued that without all of that old technology coming before it, the smartphone would have never existed. I mean, what would a smartphone know how to be if it wasn't connected to the internet, didn't have good cameras, and wasn't a built-in computer and personal digital assistant? So in a way, we have the VIC-20 and old Palm Pilots and digital cameras to thank for paving the way for the modern smartphone that basically replaced all of those things. I think that's going to wrap it up. I've been Johnny Hemberger, your mental curator. Thank you so much for joining me on Geek Therapy Radio this week. Just a reminder, it's a fresh podcast 5 days a week, the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Search for it in your favorite podcast player. Please be good to yourself and others. Know that you are worthy of love, of giving love, receiving love. You are worthy. And until next time, embrace your inner geek, because we are all geeks about something. And I'll see you next week for more Geek Therapy Radio. Take care.